This is the Barnes-Hecker mine. It was first opened in 1923 and would eventually reach 1,000 feet into the earth in an area littered with surface and underground lakes. But despite the great caution taken by the owners, something unforeseen would happen deep in one of the tunnels that would have catastrophic consequences. This is the story of the Barnes-Hecker mine disaster. As always, viewer discretion is advised. First operational in 1923, the Barnes-Hecker mine on the northern peninsula of Michigan was one of many iron ore mines along the Great Lakes between Canada and the United States. Now, despite the potential issues of mining near a body of water, being close to the lakes is also a pretty natural choice, since it meant that ships could easily ferry ore, building materials, and people between the mines in cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Toronto. This was especially important before large highways or most train lines had been built, because almost 50% of the highest quality iron ore in the US came from Michigan. And as time went on, the water only became more important when canals and locks connected the lakes to each other and then the ocean in a way ships could navigate. It's for this reason that many of the largest cities and manufacturing companies are on or near the shore in the area. Another important feature in the region is something known as the Canadian Shield. It's essentially a continent-sized area of exposed rock spanning from the northern US all the way to the Canadian Arctic. The rock is exposed because most of its soil was stripped away by the movement of glaciers in the last ice age. This left a massive portion of North America relatively flat and with soil-stripped ground that is less absorbent. This in turn left thousands of small lakes, ponds, swamps, and other waterways as the glaciers melted and receded. And the area around the town of Ishpeming, which is just south of Lake Superior, is no exception. There are dozens of small lakes in the area and even a few inside the town itself. But then even more notably than the lakes is what's in the earth beneath them. This is an area rich in iron and other minerals and resources. And so just on the outskirts of the town, about 5 miles to the west, was the Barnes-Hecker iron mine, which was one of many mines in the area operated by the Cleveland Cliffs Iron Company, taking advantage of these rich ore veins. This company was one of the 3 largest mining companies of the era, and in contrast to many other employers of the time, the owners recorded to have been unusually forward-looking. Admirably, he saw protecting the health and well-being of his employees as both important and the most efficient way to keep a company profitable. This included things like social welfare and company-sponsored English classes for its largely immigrant workforce. Now, for the most part, the Barnes-Hecker mine was fairly unremarkable as far as mines go. It only maxed out at 1,060 feet or 323 meters, with 3 main working levels at 600, 800, and 1,000 feet down. Like other mines, operations consisted mostly of drilling and blasting out tons of iron ore to meet the booming economy of 1920s America. This was a great time for innovation, and while conditions were rapidly improving for workers, down in the mines, things were still very difficult, even if they were slightly better than somewhere like the Levant mine. And in case you haven't seen the Levant mine disaster video, conditions in it were truly horrific. Like for example, workers in that mine would take a lump of clay at the beginning of their shift and then stick a candle to the top of their helmet for light. This would be the only light they'd have to work by. In contrast, in the Barnes-Hecker mine, they used new carbide lamps which could burn anywhere from 3 to 6 hours, depending on how large the lamp was. These lamps were also 4 to 6 times brighter than a candle, and they didn't produce carbon monoxide, and they used up far less oxygen from the surrounding air than a candle flame would. They could still be blown out and needed to be refilled regularly with fuel, but obviously were still a huge improvement over a candle slapped onto a helmet. The Barnes-Hecker mine even had an elevator to transport ore and men up and down, which was another huge improvement over earlier methods. But even with these better conditions, on the 3rd of November 1926, the clock began ticking without anyone even noticing. That year, the Barnes-Hecker mine had been operating for 3 years with only about 150 employees and was actually considered one of the safest mines in the county. And on the 3rd, the county mine inspector planned a visit to perform a routine inspection of the conditions. He was supposed to be joined by the mine superintendent, but on that particular day, the superintendent's wife had needed the car to drive to an appointment in town. So instead of walking the 2.5 miles to Barnes-Hecker, he'd instead gone the half mile to inspect the nearby Morris mine. It was operated by the same company and one of 2 nearby mines that Barnes-Hecker shared an emergency escape tunnel with at the bottom of their main shafts. The superintendent didn't know it at the time, but this choice would save his life. Back down in Barnes-Hecker, another man named Lewis, unlike the superintendent, wasn't supposed to be there that day. He had traded shifts with someone so they could make a doctor's appointment. In another one of the tunnels, another man named Walter was just starting his first day at work, joining his brother William, who was the mine captain. Meanwhile, another pair of brothers, George and Richard, were on their last day of work before planning to move to another mine they'd been offered a job at. As usual, work began at 7:30 that morning and everyone lined up to descend into the earth. The inspector and 4 other mining officials then followed Captain William in with the morning shift and went through every level and major operation in the mine and where they planned to work next. One of the places they may have even stopped was a drilling site on the 600-foot level where one of the day's blasts was about to be undertaken. But even if they had, none of the men could have known what was coming. Several hours later at 11:25, the inspection was coming to a close and most of the workers were starting to think about lunch and refilling their lamps. Meanwhile, the drilling crew on the 600-foot level was just putting the finishing touches on their work. They'd packed long holes with dynamite, backed off to a safe distance, and probably figured they'd blast the tunnel and give it a quick once-over before heading to lunch. Finally, once it was all set up, they detonated the explosives deep in the tunnel, splitting tons of rock and ore from the pressure. A wall of dust and the sound of the explosion then roared out through the tunnel before going silent, as was typically the case. But then, something unusual happened. A new sound came from the tunnel, and it got louder and louder as something else came through the tunnel with it. Up on the surface, one of the dozens of lakes surrounding the town shook, then plummeted down into the dirt as the lake's entire base collapsed. From the moment anything seemed to have gone wrong, the blasting crew only had seconds. First, the rumbling grew louder and louder, and then a wall of compressed air and dust raced through the tunnels and hit the miners like hurricane-force winds. This also blew out their lamps and left them in total darkness as the roar of wind was then replaced by hundreds of tons of water charging towards them. This was a literal wall of water, faster than they could run and strong enough to crush watertight doors and break bones. What the drilling crew hadn't fully known was that right above their drilling site was a 210-foot or 64-meter tall cavity in the rock, which was almost like a natural cave formation. This one in particular had originally been filled with water and sand, and miners had actually located it and were pumping it empty. This even seemed to have been going well. The outflow from the cavity was decreasing, and they thought they drained it and were ready to keep moving forward. Unfortunately, the cavern had actually relied on the internal water pressure and its own unbroken shape to support the lake hundreds of feet above it. Without knowing it, the miners had cracked the base after multiple days of slowly removing the dense ore deposits, which gave it a foundation. Then, already under the stress of hundreds of tons of water in the lake above, it shattered. This newly formed space was so massive that the entire lake drained in a matter of seconds, free-falling until it suddenly met the pinch of the mineshaft tunnels. These tunnels then turned into a choke point to create an immensely high-pressure spray, almost like putting your thumb over the end of a garden hose. To most of the miners farther away, it had only seemed like a routine blasting and they continued on with their work. But not everyone. A 22-year-old named Rutherford Wills, who was in his second year at the mine, was on the 800-foot level close to the main shaft when he heard the blast. Then a few moments later, the rush of air going up and down the main shaft knocked him over and blew out his lamp and those of his friends standing nearby. Unlike the others, Wills immediately knew something was wrong, even if he didn't know what yet, and began shouting up and down the tunnels to evacuate. Unfortunately, not all the miners spoke enough English to understand him, but either way, seconds later, the mine's power went out and they all must have understood. Before Wills could even begin climbing the ladder out, water had already begun pouring down from 200 feet above them. And with every second, it carried mud, rocks, pieces of broken timber, tools, and horrifyingly, the bodies of workers unfortunate enough to be swept away in the currents. This shaft Wills was in was the central shaft, and so all the tunnels in every level led to it. This meant that all the water would first pour into it and then work its way up from there and fill every single part of the mine. So with essentially a whole lake pouring into the mine like a pressurized hose, Wills began to climb 200 feet or the height of a 20-story building on wet, mud-soaked ladders while literally inside a waterfall. Just behind him were some of his friends and a handful of others lucky enough to be nearby. The mine's electric elevator had already shorted out, and with how quickly the mine was filling, it wouldn't have been fast enough anyway. Instead, the men had to climb minute after minute using all the strength they had not to be ripped off the ladder by the tons of water pouring down on them. They also had to do this in near total darkness while also having to turn their faces down and shield them just to take a breath. When they finally reached the 600-foot level, the water was also coming at them from the side too before plummeting down the shaft from where they just climbed up. And still struggling with every inch of progress, but finally above the waterfall, Wills led the group on toward the exit. But then a second later, he looked back after something shook the ladder to see no sign of the men who had just been behind him. Horrifyingly, some piece of debris had fallen and broke the ladder just below, causing the men to plummet back into the shaft below. Even worse, the rising water was closer than it had been a few minutes before, and it seemed as though it was closing the distance on him. Several miles away, the mine superintendent was doing his walkthrough of the Morris mine when a frantic worker came running through the tunnel looking for him. He then explained there'd been an emergency at the Barnes Hecker, but it wasn't clear exactly what happened. They all then ran for the surface, where a miner was already in their car and driving away to help. The superintendent then jumped onto the car's running board and held on, hoping to get there in time to assist in any way he could. All the while, Wills had been climbing non-stop in the dark, trying to outpace the water. He'd already ripped off his gloves with his teeth back in the waterfall since they kept sliding in the mud, but now he was climbing up and up what must have seemed like an endless distance. In fact, the distance he still needed to cover was the same as the height of a 60-story building, and below him, the water was filling at a rate of 62.5 feet a minute, or about 1 foot per second. If he slowed down for even a few moments, the freezing November water would cover him and sap even more of his strength. Apparently, at times, the rising water even reached as high as his waist as he scaled the ladder. As an aside, it might seem like it would make sense to simply float up with the water, but between how cold the water was and how unpredictable the current might have been, or the debris in the water, climbing was definitely the safer choice. In fact, the water up to his waist was so cold that both his legs were cramping as he climbed. So in a case of literal tunnel vision, he kept going and going until he finally reached the outstretched arms of his friends who would come down the ladder to help him. With their help, he then scrambled up the last 100 feet or so until the moment they reached the top. Finally, he collapsed onto the ground, totally unconscious from the pain and exhaustion. His body just completely shut down. As the men revived Wills with smelling salts out of fear he might die of hypothermia if he remained unconscious, the superintendent and the others looked down anxiously because he was the only person to make it out of the mine. Wills had climbed up 80 stories in just 14 minutes, covered in freezing cold water, mud, pelted with rocks, and not given any chance to take a break. Tragically, all the others had either been washed from the ladder or never had the chance to even get to one before the water blinded them and overpowered them. We don't know exactly what happened to all of them, but it's believed that 13 men were on the 600-foot level, 15 were on the 800-foot, and the remaining 24 were down at the bottom at 1,000 feet. Shortly after Wills escaped, the superintendent ordered that both the Morris and nearby Lloyd mine be evacuated, fearing that the emergency tunnels that connected all three would cause them to flood as well. Thankfully, that didn't end up being necessary, as debris and sand plugged them before they could fully flood. So by 4 p.m. that day, the superintendent and a team of miners were trudging through waist-deep water in the Morris emergency tunnel to inspect the damage. There, they found the bodies of the mine captain William and the county inspector, along with several others. It's thought that they must have been at the very end of their inspection in the deepest tunnels of the mine when everything happened and tried to make an escape. Although they never made it out, the water did push their bodies through the debris before the tunnel was plugged, allowing them to be found. In the aftermath, there would be no serious rescue attempts made into Barnes Hecker. Workers and family members could only use buckets and the ore skip to try and bail water out of the mine, but this was an impossible task. In addition, there was just no one left to rescue. Even if someone had found a pocket of air, in 1926 the technology to get them simply wasn't available. Even today, with how large the mine is and the potential for collapses, it likely wouldn't have been possible even if a team of cave diving specialists had been waiting at the entrance. It had taken only 15 minutes for the water to fill the mine up to 185 feet, or 56 meters below the surface. This was also over 400 feet above the highest working level in the mine where the breach began, meaning every single tunnel and passage was submerged. This was also just 1 minute longer than it took Wills to reach the surface with a 200-foot head start. In addition to those who were lost, 42 wives had been widowed and 132 children had lost their fathers. In a tiny community like Ishpeming, there wasn't a single household left unaffected. Like for example, Lewis's son had been at a store that day when a truck drove past on its way to the disaster. He then ran home to tell his father about it, only to learn that his father had traded shifts with a coworker and had already gone to work on an earlier shift than usual. By 8 p.m. on the day of the accident, the few bodies that had been found were recovered, and the next day an all-volunteer crew from other Cleveland Cliffs mines arrived to help continue the search and hopefully reclaim the mine, but in the end, it was a lost cause. By the 20th of November, only 3 more bodies had been recovered, which were the 3 men who fell when the ladder broke just behind Wills, bringing the total to 10 recovered. In that time, the water had receded down to the 540-foot mark, but then just minutes after the recovery team left that day, a mud dam elsewhere in the mine gave way and flooded the shaft all over again. It was decided then and there that the rest were simply too dangerous to locate. With little idea where the water might have washed them or how stable many of the tunnels were, the Barnes Hecker mine was declared the men's tomb and sealed shut. Following this decision, debates would continue for years if the company was at fault for the accident or if it truly were out of their control. On one hand, they were aware of the many lakes above and underground, but at the same time, as far as they had known, they were safely draining the underground lakes, and when the pumps ran out of water to remove it, it had seemed safe to continue. In the end, following a coroner's inquest in 1927, the Barnes Hecker mine inundation was ruled an accident. But admirably, the company still opted to give every family involved a pension of $50 a month, or the equivalent of $866 in 2024. Rutherford Wills, the only survivor, would never again set foot in a mine shaft. Plagued by nightmares for the rest of his life, he would move to Flint, Michigan and work for Buick instead as a plant security officer. In 1943, he briefly returned to Ishpeming and got a surface job at a mine, but returned to Flint as soon as he was able to. Then, in 1972, Wills would receive approval from his doctor to come back to the mine one last time for the unveiling of a monument where the mine is located. He would pass away the next year in 1973 of kidney cancer. The Barnes Hecker inundation remains the worst mining disaster in Michigan state history, but despite that is little known even among Michigan residents. However, many relatives and descendants of those involved have done a great job keeping their story alive. The daughter of one of the men lost would go on to become the family historian, and she saved newspapers, interviews, and all sorts of details which are now carried on by her granddaughter. The research for this story would not have been possible without all their continued efforts. Today, just a couple of blocks from the center of Ishpeming, there is now a memorial plaque with the names of all those lost. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description. I can't thank you all enough for your great suggestions. I would say at least a quarter of all the stories covered in this channel have been submitted by you, including this one, so they really do help a great deal. In any case, thanks again for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.